Okay, perfect. So today we're going to be talking about the Lamiaceae family. So just I guess before I get going with the presentation, I will say I do plan on continuing this Zoom series. So just kind of be on the lookout for the next classes that are scheduled. But I do plan on having another one of these classes next month in May. So I'll release that schedule here in the next week or two. But to go ahead and get started, so the Lamiaceae is also known most commonly as the mint family. It does go by several other names, such as the dead nettle family or the sage family, and we're going to actually be talking about a lot of those today. So this is a very large plant family, kind of estimated over 7,000 species that are around. And the they really consist primarily of a lot of herbaceous plants, especially for ones that we grow here in Kentucky. They may range from herbaceous perennials to annuals, but we do have several species in this family that are what we consider subshrubs, where they can get quite woody, especially at the base of the plant, or as they continue to age, they develop kind of more of this woody structure, but they may still have some kind of tender herbaceous growth to them. But one common characteristic with this whole family is that they all have an opposite leaf arrangement as well as square stems. So that is something that's very unique. You know, with a lot of plants, they have rounder stems, but if you look at these very closely and you see the square stems opposite leaves, more than likely that's going to be a member of the mint family. So that's kind of a really defining characteristic here. Now, something else that this family may have, not all of the members do, but many of the members are often aromatic. And so whenever you touch the leaves or you crush them or different parts of the plant, they are often very fragrant. And that kind of will go into its economic importance that we'll talk about here in a minute. Now, the flowers, all of them, if you look at them closely, sometimes we have clusters of flowers, sometimes we have spikes of flowers. But if you look at each individual flower, this family consistently has these two-lipped tubular type flowers. Oftentimes they range in different colors. A lot of times they're kind of more of your cooler colors, your bluish, purples, lavenders, whites, and pinks, kind of more within that range. One common characteristic too is a lot of pollinators really love the flowers of these plants. And we'll talk about that too, that even some of the plants we may use more for culinary purposes, if you will, sometimes if you let them flower out, then it provides a good nectar source for our insect populations. So with this family, really contains a lot of your herbs that we use for cooking, but then we also have many ornamentals as well. So anything from sage, mint, lavender, basil, rosemary, oregano, thyme, marjoram, coleus, bee balm, lemon balm, catnip, catmint, all of these plants belong to this family. So again, it's a very, very broad family. Um, and where a lot of the plants we're going to talk about today, a good many of them are found in the Mediterranean region of the planet. Especially a lot of our herbs are found in those native Mediterranean regions, but there are a couple of native plants that we will talk about today that are found here in Kentucky too. So Let me talk a little bit about some of the uses for this family, and then we'll kind of go ahead and talk about just general mints, since this is the so-called mint family. But with the Lamiaceae family, it has very high economic importance. Okay, first off, talking from the culinary perspective, a lot of the plants used from this family are used as seasonings and as spices, to our different, recipes. And so they hold pretty significant importance there. A lot of this family is does have medicinal components to them that we'll talk about, especially aiding in things like antibacterial, anti-inflammatory, just good for gastrointestinal issues, things of that nature. And then something else, cosmetic. This is a big family for cosmetic purposes. So we think about how big the beauty industry is, but then also just for your standard bathroom toiletry products, a lot of them contain members of this family. So anything from your toothpaste to your shampoo to your soap. You may even use essential oils. To aid in something like, stress relief, or maybe you have something like a decongestant just to kind of help your sinuses, things of that nature. You may use products that contain members of these family. Kind of going back into kind of the food aspect, not only do we think of flavored gum that has like our spearmint, peppermint, but we use mint in different beverages, jellies, things of that nature. Sometimes it's even good just to add, something like mint to sweet tea or to lemonade or to water, just to give it, kind of a nice refreshed taste to it. Something else I'll mention as well with this family is a lot of these family members actually act as natural insect repellents too. And so you may see, especially online, quite a bit, what are some good plants that will deter pests or deter mosquitoes or, things like that. And so a lot of the mint family is commonly used as that because the oils that are found in these plants do act as natural insect repellents. Now, with that in mind, these still can pose some insect problems. Like if you're growing it, you could still see some insects like feeding on it, but they are kind of a more hardy, durable plant family compared to other ones. And there are actually, some insect repellents that we may be able to purchase that may contain, compounds that are extracted from members of this family. So very interesting plant family, and just in general, they serve quite a lot of purposes. Um, Kind of before I leave this slide, I have two pictures here with our kind of most common mints that we talk about, and that's peppermint and spearmint. And these are ones that you can find easily. You may even be able to find them in your grocery store aisle as well. Peppermint, of course, has a slightly different aroma than spearmint. The plant does differ. You kind of have kind of a darker foliage. Usually the foliage is smaller, and then you've got dark stem coloration on peppermint, whereas spearmint is a very upright, I mean, it's all aggressive. We're going to talk about how aggressive this mint family is, but certainly spearmint can be quite a spreader, and it usually has kind of that brighter green, larger foliage. A lot of times, whenever we buy a mint plant in the stores, a lot of times it is a spearmint plant. So I just kind of have that there where you can kind of see the variations a little bit. And you'll also notice with the spearmint, it has a little bit more serration to the margins, to the leaf edges as well. But of course, peppermint, spearmint, so important in a lot of these products that we use just in daily life. All right. So let's move on and let's talk about another herb. So again, it's going to be pretty herb heavy, but we're going to talk about a few different things. So first one is basil. So there are a number of different species of basil as well as many different cultivated varieties that are out there on the market. Generally, here in Kentucky, this is going to be treated as an annual. It's not native here, primarily found in parts of Asia and Africa. Now, as we treat it like an annual, I will say it's a pretty easygoing plant that even if, you have to, even if it's killed by frost, um, a lot of times you could bring the plants inside or you can start new seeds all over again. And it makes a really great, indoor herb to have that grows pretty well under grow lights. So this is a very common plant, a common herb in a lot of our gardens. So foliage is going to differ depending on the variety. We have small and large leaf varieties. We have some that are more of a solid green to others that are more purple in coloration. But all of them produce these spikes of white to pink flowers, again, depending on the variety. Now, of course, when we're growing basil, generally we don't want this to start flowering. A lot of times we remove the flower buds just because it is going to it's going to take away the quality of the basil leaf. But if you did have some basil that you were letting grow out and flower out, a lot of pollinators are going to kind of flock to the basil, especially bees. Bees absolutely love basil plants. Now, when you're growing this basil, often it's pretty strong. It has kind of more of a spicy smell and flavor to it. Um, it's really funny because whenever I do herb classes with some of our school age kids, I would think basil would be a very popular one among them, but it is not. They do not care for how strong basil can be. A lot of times they tend to gravitate um, more towards the mint family members. So, um, with when it comes to being used in cuisines. So this is very commonly, of course, we think of our stereotypical Italian cuisines, but this is found in a lot of Italian cuisines. We use it, of course, number one is for making our pesto to put on our pasta. We may use it in different vinegars, or even garnish it on something like pizza. We may even put it in our drinks, kind of like mint, where it just kind of adds a nice refreshing taste to it. But it is something that is more found in other types of cuisine. So there's different basil species around the world, and so it is commonly used in a lot of our Indonesian, Thai, and Vietnamese cuisines too. So very broad culinary area with this. With basil, it does have a lot of health benefits. So it is rich in vitamins and minerals, anything from containing antioxidants to having vitamins A, K, C, and being a good source of magnesium, iron, potassium, calcium, just overall really good, rich plant, to have all those vitamins and minerals that you may need. When it comes to kind of medicinal effects, sometimes, I mean, of course, you'd have to eat pretty large quantities of this, but kind of similar to other mint family members, sometimes it may aid in gastrointestinal problems. Sometimes it has kind of more of these antibacterial properties to them as well. So, again, really good, rich in nutrients, but also may have some other benefits to it as well. Um, so that is your basil. And I have to say with basil, like, I mean, that is one of the easiest herbs to just start from seed, especially if like you have a plant and it's large, it's getting worn down and you just want to start from scratch. Very easy plant to just start from seed, will pop right up. And again, does very well indoors under grow lights. All right, let's move to another plant. Let's move to our sage. So, the Salvia officinalis is commonly called culinary sage, but it also goes by the name common sage. This is probably going to be one of the more common sages that you see. And we have a lot of varieties that are more kind of the original species is a solid green variety, but there are several cultivars out there that have variegated foliage, may have some white variegation. There may be some that have even more of a purplish tint to the leaves. So there are several varieties that are out there of this plant. Um, but this is one that we kind of typically can use as a perennial. I will say sometimes it may not be a very long-lived perennial before it kind of, just dies off over time. If you especially have issues where your soil remains wet for long periods, or unfortunately, Mother Nature gives us too much rain, just like the 12 and a half inches of rain our area just got a few days ago. Um, but one thing you'll notice with a lot of plants in this family is they really don't like having wet feet. They don't like their roots being wet. And so you really want to make sure they're in well draining soil. And culinary sage is a good example of that. So just know that it's in more of a wet location. It may be short-lived, unfortunately, but you can still get relatively a few solid years out of this. And the thing with this plant is just by kind of rubbing and touching the leaves, very aromatic, very pleasant smell. A lot of times you can use those either fresh or you can dry them. And I will say you usually don't need a ton of sage um, in your cooking recipes, just because otherwise, if you put too much, it could be a little overbearing, a little bit too strong. So just be mindful of that. But overall, to me, very pleasant. Um, the flowers are gorgeous. So they have these beautiful lavender blue spikes that they produce, and the pollinators absolutely love it. The bees and butterflies just flock to this plant. And so it's funny because I have this plant in my garden, but I actually use it less for culinary purposes and more as a pollinator plant. I just let it flower out and let the pollinators enjoy it as a nectar source. So, really good for that. Really pretty ornamental. Has a really nice kind of clumping structure to it. It can spread, but you can kind of keep it a little bit more maintained in the garden. Going back to culinary purposes, you a lot of times people will use sage, especially in like our Thanksgiving dinner, for instance. So commonly used on poultry dishes like chicken and turkey, but you can use it on other meat like lamb. You can bake it into biscuits, add it to your oils and butters, and it just really adds, a lovely fragrance and taste to it. Just like other members of this family, again, it has those bacteria, anti-inflammatory, contains the antioxidant properties. And so, these are really good additions whenever you're using these for cooking to help with those health benefits. All right. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and I'm going to talk about one we don't really, sometimes people may use this for tea, but more commonly a native plant that we may have in a native plant garden to try to help the pollinators. And so this is, again, going away from culinary purposes. Let's talk about hoary mountain mint. So there's actually a few different species of mountain mint. This is one that we kind of are probably a little bit more familiar with. just because with hoary mountain mint, it usually has kind of a whitish appearance on the upper leaves and bracts. And so kind of what we think might be petals are actually these modified leaf bracts that kind of surround the actual flower clusters. And so the flowers themselves may not look very interesting. But if you look at them very closely, they're very teeny tiny. A lot of times they're these little white flowers um, that you see. But even if they may not be, I would say, as aesthetic as some of the other members of this family, this is certainly a great native plant to have. Again, because it really provides a good nectar source for a lot of our pollinator species, but also it serves as a larval food source to a lot of our butterfly and caterpillar species as well. Something, for example, would be the wavy-lined emerald moth caterpillar will feed on this plant. And the emerald moth is just kind of, as its name suggests, it's this really pretty um, green moth species. Also, some of the smaller butterflies really enjoy this plant, like your hair streaks. So we have things like your gray hair streaks. That again, they're pretty teeny tiny, especially when you kind of compare them to your fingernail. But they generally really like the mountain mints. And so, if you are especially someone who you're trying to protect these pollinators, you're trying to kind of help the biodiversity of your garden, then you'll want to incorporate hoary mountain mint into that garden. Now, with that in mind, you're probably going to want to give this plenty of room to grow and maybe not put it so close to other plants because, as I mentioned, members of this family are very aggressive. Um, some of the non-native species, I would even say, are invasive, but I would never call a native species like hoary mountain mint invasive. It's just more of an aggressive grower. At least it's found here, and it serves a lot of beneficial impacts. So just kind of know that you really want to kind of give it its own space. Otherwise, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to just break up those roots and dig up those roots, hit them with a spade or whatever you need to do just to kind of prevent it from spreading to areas, preventing it from spreading to areas you don't want it to be at. But with that in mind, if you need a good plant for erosion control, this is a good native plant for erosion control. So it'll spread pretty well for you. Um, a couple other things with it. I should have mentioned this before. Um, Not only are a lot of these plants serving as insect repellents, if you will, they're also very good deer repellents. Lot of deer really do not care for the mint family because of the strong aromas, oils that are found in the leaves. So generally, they won't really pick at these as much. Now, I say that they could still very much do that, especially if they're hungry enough or you have a large population of deer. They could still mow down your plants, but it is not typically the preferred food of deer. So just keep that in mind. At least a lot of members of this family are relatively deer resistant. What else? With mountain mint, just kind of like with other mint, it does have an aroma, especially whenever you kind of rub and crush the foliage. It has kind of more of a spearmint smell to it. All right. So moving back into kind of our world of herbs, let's talk about lavender. So of course, lavender, oh my goodness, we just see this in everything, right? We see this in a lot of our beauty products. We see this in our essential oils. We, may use it even it's kind of becoming a little bit more popular. Like it seems like in like different teas and coffee drinks and things like that. But generally, kind of less culinary, more used in the beauty industry. Although there are lavender cookies that are quite delicious. But anyway, so there's several different lavender species, and I'll kind of get to them in the next slide. But in general, we're going to be talking primarily about our English lavender. That's kind of the most common one that, especially here in Kentucky, that we're able to get our hands on and that we're going to grow in our garden. And so in general, with lavender, has more of this tender gray green to silvery green foliage. In time, as the plant ages, it generally does get more of a woody base to it. Something to keep in mind that if you are trimming your lavender, you want to only be making sure that you're trimming the tender herbaceous growth. If you accidentally cut it all the way down to the woody base, it probably is not going to come back for you. Just because you've kind of taken away all of that important growth to it. So when you're trimming it, you're kind of trimming it to shape it, or you're trimming it to actually maybe use the foliage in something, or you're using it to cut the flowers as well. So, but just be mindful of that, is try not to cut too much into that woody plant growth. Now, the flower spikes are gorgeous. They're kind of more of this purpley blue coloration to them. So you can cut the flower spikes if you want to use them. I would recommend cutting them right as the flowers are starting to open. It's almost too late if the flowers are fully open. You're really not going to get as much for that if you're using it like in some kind of flower arrangement, or if you're, you know, going to use it in some kind of recipe or in some kind of beauty product. So just kind of watch that. Um, Generally with lavender, kind of going from more of a growing standpoint, um, needs to have full sun, at least 6 or more hours of full sun a day. Definitely needs to be very well draining. This plant can be a little finicky, and that's okay if you haven't had luck with lavender before. Generally, these prefer to have more of a neutral to alkaline soil. So whenever I say that, we look at our pH scale, pH scale goes up to 14. 0 to 7 is more acidic, 7 to 14 is more alkaline. So generally, you want this to be at a 7 to 8 or above range, just because it doesn't quite care for acidic soils very much. So definitely do a soil test if you're not sure about that. Also make sure, again, this hates wet feet. It is going to rot away if it is in too much water. And then just finally, lavender. I don't want to say it's a short-lived perennial because these can last for several years. But one thing I will say is usually about after 10 years or so, this plant does kind of start to die back or decline over time. And so it's not going to be like, say your peonies where they could last 50 or more years in your garden. Lavender just, usually it seems like it's at the 10-year mark or so, it just generally starts to decline. So just know that, you may have to replace it eventually. So why do we grow lavender so much? Well, if you just know the smell of lavender, it's just a very soothing, calming fragrance. And so it's used in a lot of our aromatherapy essential oils, really great shampoo, soaps, perfumes, all of that nature. So let's kind of talk about some of the different types of lavender and which one they may be used for. So again, our English lavender, that's one we can get our hands on most commonly in the greenhouse and nursery industry. This is kind of more the ornamental that we are growing and enjoying in our gardens that, again, pollinators are going to love. But of course, you can cut the flowers and use the flowers for different purposes. There's also French lavender, which you may see a little bit less commonly, but there are some cultivars out there you can find that kind of even have more of this like raspberry coloration to them. But generally, French lavender is one that's used most in perfumes. And so if you have a lavender for perfume, generally it's French lavender. There's also spike lavender, and spike lavender, kind of that top picture there, generally is used more in essential oils. It's more fragrant than some of the other lavender species. So just kind of giving you an idea that these different species of lavender may be used for different purposes. Finally, there's Spanish lavender. Um, Commonly, this one actually is what you would see more like in an air freshener. It also does have some insect repellent properties to them. May even be used in certain insecticides as well to kind of repel those insects. Generally, though, Spanish lavender is not typically one that we grow very well here in Kentucky. A lot of times it's more finicky, not very hardy, compared to the other ones. But hopefully, this just gives you kind of a general idea of these different lavender types. All right. So let's go back to some native plants. So this is a native plant, obedient plant, which as we know is not very obedient. But it's interesting because the common name obedient plant actually comes from not from the irony that it is actually a very aggressive grower, but more from the flowers. And so if you were to like kind of push the flower spike, kind of move it into a different direction, the flowers will actually stay in that spot, stay in that different direction for a certain period of time. So they're actually obedient. They're staying in place for you. So that's kind of where it gets that name from. Um, but again, it is really ironic that it's called obedient plant when it is a very aggressive spreader. But again, it's aggressive, but it is native, so it does serve a lot of good purposes to it. It also goes by the name false dragon head as well. And you notice that because it definitely has kind of more of those snapdragon-like qualities to the flowers, but it is actually a mint member. It's not, mistakenly put in the Plantagenaceae family, for instance. But if you look closely, it has kind of more of those two-lipped tubular flowers, and oftentimes they are more of a pink to kind of pale purpley color. And as it opens, you'll notice that the flowers will bud out and open at the bottom first, then making their way up to the top. A lot of times with obedient plant, this is kind of actually one of these species of mints that does do well in more wet settings. So kind of forget what I just said about some of the herbs that hate their feet being wet. This is one plant that doesn't mind its feet wet. It actually is going to be typically found in more wet meadow regions, wetland areas, especially across the state. And so if you do have a little wet area that's, relatively bright sun, this might be a good plant to put there, especially if you have plenty of room for it to kind of take over and spread. Um, and it's really nice because this is one that's a pretty long bloomer. Um, and that's a nice thing about this family in general. A lot of members of this family will bloom most of the summer into the fall. And this is a good example of that. Usually it's typically starts blooming midsummer and it'll go all the way to our first frost date. So very nice in that regard. If you have this, bees, butterflies, hummingbirds are just going to flock to it. And again, finally, is relatively resistant to deer browsing. Or if deer do browse on it, it can bounce back easily. Oregano. So let's talk about oregano. So again, going back to our other herbs. So oregano, its scientific name, it basically is Greek for beauty of the mountain. Um, and so this is kind of more of a ground cover, low growing plant. Um, just depending on the species that you have. Once it flowers, it does kind of buff up a little bit. But the flowers are lovely. It usually they're going to vary a little bit where they could be kind of more of these circular clusters to ranging in spikes, just depending. But generally, they're kind of more of a white to pink flower. And when they are in bloom, bees just, whoo, man, they go at it. Very, very strongly, they go at it. Again, this is native to the Mediterranean region, although it kind of has, naturalized in other regions of the world. This is a perennial. We do consider this a perennial. Again, it's kind of similar where it may not be as long-lived, or over time it just kind of might decline or get a little rough looking. So, but definitely allow plenty of space for this to spread in your garden because it will. When you touch the leaves, when you rub them, very aromatic. Um, Oftentimes, the oregano that you have is usually hairy, although there are more smooth varieties as well. But some of them can be quite hairy and fuzzy to the touch. That it's kind of fun that you just want to go by and just kind of touch it all the time. Overall, the smell is kind of more this warm, spicy flavor. And what do we use oregano most for? Again, we kind of go back to Italian cooking, one of the most common seasonings in pizza. And so that's like how I get, again, a lot of my students excited for these herbs. It's like, look, this is used a lot on pizza. And then they're like, ooh, I want more of this. So it gets them excited for oregano. Um, but you can use this in your pasta and bread, soup, stews. You could even add it onto a salad if you want. It's a good seasoning for kind of more of your red meats, your like steak and so on. And just like some of the other members of this family, does aid with some gastrointestinal problems. It has certain anti-inflammatory, antimicrobial properties as well. Again, I say that I don't know how like thoroughly researched some of those properties are, but in general, this family has been found to have some of that. Rosemary. Um, so again, I kind of go back to like the like how my students react to this. And a lot of them either love rosemary or they hate it. Just because it can be so strong. Rosemary just in general has a very pungent, spicy smell. I absolutely love it. I kind of think of it more having this lovely pine-like smell to it. Um, but sometimes people might think it's a little overbearing. And that would be the case with this in your different recipes. You don't need a lot of rosemary for it to add a kick. And especially if you're making like some kind of like rosemary chicken, for instance, you want to definitely be a little bit a little mindful on how much you put in there. But it is very commonly used for things like poultry, pork, fish, lamb, in dressings. Again, around the time of Thanksgiving, our turkey dinners, things of that nature. This can be used in different beauty products as well. Again, commonly used in shampoos, soaps, perfume. I love rosemary soap. Oh, it's just so wonderful. Just lovely. Um, Positives, again, helping again with digestive issues. Even might be a little bit of research out there that it might help with preventing slash treating baldness. Don't really know much about that, but I have seen that. cited in a few different locations, so might be something interesting to kind of look into. Um, but kind of going back to um, just the growth of this plant, how you grow it here in Kentucky, let's kind of talk about that. Because again, it is native more to the Mediterranean areas. And so in Kentucky, a lot of times it's what we consider a tender perennial. Usually this is going to survive outside in more zones 8 plus. Where we are, we're in a zone 7. Um, if we have a very mild winter, then and it's well insulated, sometimes we will have rosemary that will survive outside. However, if we do get a harsh winter where we get, unfortunately, some polar vortex stuff happening, then it may die off. And so, what you can do if you want to save your rosemary for the next year, like if you don't want to have to buy a new plant or restart it, just because germination is not always the best route, like starting it from seed, then you could keep it in a container and bring that container inside and just let it survive. It doesn't have to thrive indoors all winter. It just needs to survive until you can kind of get it back outdoors again. Um, and so, again, it could serve that purpose. Generally, though, it's not really a plant that I would recommend keeping indoors all year round. It is just generally going to struggle. It's not quite as easygoing as our basil plant, but um, again, one that you would want to keep around. Um, Foliage is very needle-like, and one interesting characteristic is if you look on the underside of the leaves, it kind of has a white band. And so that might help you with kind of identifying this as well compared to other members of this mint family, because a lot of them might have kind of very similar foliage in that regard. Although if you just kind of rub the leaves and you smell it, you may like, oh yeah, that's definitely rosemary. Um, a lot of times we don't really want it to bloom because, again, once it gets to the blooming stage, the quality is reduced because all the energy is going to the flowers and not the foliage. But if you do let it bloom out, again, the pollinators are going to love it. And they are very pretty blooms as well. All right, thyme. So thyme, I kind of think a lot too along the same lines as kind of oregano. This is kind of more of a low growing ground cover, and there are actually some non-culinary thyme species that we may use kind of as ground covers in our garden beds. Again, considered a perennial here. Again, is it long-lived? Again, it kind of craps out a little bit after a few years, if I'm being honest. Or it just kind of starts to look a little rough around the edges. So, you may just have to get some new plants after a while. But it will stay for a while in your garden. Thyme, you can use this either for culinary uses or as an ornamental. So like I said, there's different ornamental species that make great ground covers. Um, but otherwise, you can let this go to bloom and it gets, again, kind of these more white to purple flower clusters, good nectar source for our bees and butterflies. So really good in that regard that you could just let it flower out and keep it as an ornamental. But if not, you can keep it trimmed. You can cut it for culinary uses. You can use it fresh or you can use it dried. And it's good for a number of seasonings in different soups, stews, casseroles, poultry dishes, etc. I quite like the smell of thyme. I actually like it more like as I guess you could say as a beauty product rather than even in culinary food. It's a quite calming smell in my mind, and so it's really good in soaps and um, perfumes, and sometimes you might see it in even like your deodorant or things of that nature. Thyme, in general, it has a lot of good properties to it, not only just for eating, um, good sources of vitamins, but this also has been known to have some kind of bacterial, insecticidal, antifungal properties to them that might be used to help, again, deter certain pests or insects. Um, kind of going along that nature. What's really interesting with thyme is its uses dates back a long period in the history of the world. And so back when, unfortunately, Europe was plagued, literally plagued with the bubonic plague, when they didn't know, what was the source of the plague, what was causing it. A lot of times people would actually wear thyme, almost like a necklace around them as a way to try to protect them from, you know, being infected with the plague. So really not, yeah, of course, not going to help them so much with that. But it would have made them smell good, I'm sure. I'm sure it would have smelled lovely having it around. Um, their necks, but yeah, not so much for helping to prevent the plague, unfortunately. Um, but kind of along those lines, this is one of those things where it's good smelling, kind of similar to lavender. It helps to relieve stress. Maybe it calm these people down. And it does have some tendencies to be a good cough remedy as well. So kind of helping, if you have a cough, sore throat, something like that. So time serves multiple purposes. All right, let's finish up with one of our native plants. So let's finish up with our Monarda fistulosa, otherwise known as our wild bergamot. So, some people may have used this wild bergamot in certain medicinal teas, things of that nature, but this is a different bergamot from what's actually used in teas like say Earl Grey, things of that nature, a different kind of bergamot. So just kind of know that difference. Um, but with wild bergamot, this is a native here to Kentucky. A lot of times we find this kind of more in dry regions, more dry meadows, prairies, along roadways, and some of our fields. We may see it spring up, especially if it's not been overplanted with something else. Um, Also a type of bee balm. So there is another bee balm called Monarda didyma, that is also widely available in the nursery trade. I'll say this with Monarda didyma. That is the one that kind of has more of those colorful cultivars out there. Really the vibrant raspberries and wine colors and bright purples and, different colors of blooms. Um, with Monarda fistulosa, on the other hand, it typically just has that one kind of pale pink bloom. Um, a lot of people kind of say it's a little less showy. It's kind of the less showy version of the Monarda didyma, but honestly, I love this probably more so than the other Monarda, just because, again, great native plant, really helpful to our pollinators. So especially our hummingbirds will just flock to this plant. Just because you can see it produces those beautiful little tubular clusters that are kind of, arranged globular in shape. Um, and this is a good bloomer too. Again, this is blooming pretty much all summer long from June to September. And so, I mean, you may deadhead occasionally, but I mean, overall, this is going to be a nice spreader and a nice bloomer in your garden. Definitely give it plenty of play, plenty of room to grow because it will take over, of course. Um, Keep it in bright light. If it's in kind of a more shaded region, it may struggle or kind of flop over a little bit more. So the brighter the light, the better. Um, uh, Also, this plant can be a good host plant for certain native specialized bees. And so a lot of um, native plants in the Lamiaceae family, that the native ones we talked about, may host some specialized bee species as well. Um, Overall, pretty easygoing plant. Can be prone to powdery mildew like some of the other bee balms. This one actually not as bad as others. How you can kind of reduce that powdery mildew is just kind of provide some good air circulation in there. Don't have too much of it kind of confined with if you have a lot of plants around it, just kind of give it plenty of space to spread easily and just to give it that circulation. Otherwise, even if it gets powdery mildew, not something I would even worry too much about or have to use some kind of, fungicide on. I mean, generally, it's not going to be enough to harm the plant long term. Just might be a little bit of an eyesore that you notice it on there. Again, deer resistant, relatively deer resistant, even rabbit resistant. But again, just because I am saying these things does not mean that they may not touch them, but they just are not partial to this plant family. And so that is one good thing you have going for you. Especially I know a lot of us that live in town in Madisonville have a high deer population, unfortunately. So we may be looking at certain plants that maybe the deer are not going to be as focused in on. And so this would be a good plant option for that in mind. All right. So with that, um, I'm going to stop the presentation for today. And I am going to kind of finish. I'm going to stop recording.